January 31, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank McCoy stood before the aircraft, camera in his trembling hands. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber sat untouched on the tarmac, tail number 763-12 gleaming in the tropical sun. 20 meters from nose to tail. 25-meter wingspan. Intact. Operational. Abandoned. His team had examined dozens of wrecked Japanese aircraft across the Pacific. But never one like this. Complete. Pristine. Ready to fly. "Sir," his sergeant called from the wing. "You need to see this." McCoy climbed through the inspection panel. Inside the wing cavity, fuel tanks stretched along the structure. He ran his hand along the surface. Thin aluminum. Perhaps 2 millimeters. No protective coating. No rubber sealant. No armor plating. Nothing between thousands of liters of high-octane fuel and enemy bullets except bare metal. "This cannot be their standard design," McCoy whispered. "No Air Force would build bombers this way." But they had. And this single aircraft would reveal why thousands of Japanese airmen died in flames across 4 years of war. 4 years earlier. December 8, 1941. Same location. Lieutenant James Harrington watched 82 bombers materialize at 20,000 feet. Perfect formation. Beyond anti-aircraft range. The first bombs fell at 12:35 in the afternoon. 636 bombs across Clark Field in minutes. Then Zero fighters swept low, their machine guns shredding every aircraft that survived. 12 of 17 beat, 17 flying fortresses destroyed. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk reduced to burning wreckage. Harrington crouched in his shelter, powerless. American air power in the Philippines died in 45 minutes. The Betty bombers had flown 460 miles from Formosa. A range American bombers could not match. They struck with complete surprise, delivered devastating payload, and departed untouched. The war's opening hours demonstrated what the Betty could do when facing limited opposition. 2 days later. South China Sea. December 10, 1941. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, Britain's most powerful warships in Asian waters, steamed without air cover. Japanese reconnaissance had tracked them through the night. At 12:20, 26 G4M Betty bombers arrived, carrying Type 91 torpedoes. Each torpedo weighed 840 kilograms, with 205 kilograms of explosives. The attack was surgical. Coordinated waves from multiple angles. The torpedoes ran shallow, designed for striking ships even in coastal waters. Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons, took at least 6 torpedo hits. Massive underwater explosions ripped the hull open. Flooding overwhelmed damage control. The ship began listing. Repulse absorbed 4 torpedoes while maneuvering frantically. Anti-aircraft fire claimed several attackers, but couldn't stop the coordinated runs. Both ships capsized within 2 hours. 841 British sailors died. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves have been sunk solely by air power in open sea. The Betty bomber achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. 90 minutes ended British naval supremacy in Asia. Across the Pacific through early 1942, Betty bombers operated with seeming impunity. They struck Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles distant. They attacked Port Moresby across New Guinea's mountains. They hit Guadalcanal from Rabaul, 600 miles away. The extraordinary range gave Japan strategic reach no Allied force could match. American fighters lacked range to intercept Bettys departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese positions that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. But this advantage depended entirely on limited fighter opposition. When Bettys could approach at high altitude, strike without interception, and depart before fighters arrived, they were devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized early 1942, when Allied air strength remained dispersed and limited. By mid-1942, the tactical picture began shifting. American fighter strength increased. Wildcats gave way to Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Tactical doctrine evolved. Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. August 8, 1942. Guadalcanal. 23 G4M bombers departed Rabaul to attack American positions. American fighters intercepted over Savo Island. 18 of 23 bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in the single worst G4M loss of the campaign. Fighter pilots reported identical observations across every engagement. Betty bombers exploded into flames from minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along fuselage or wings produced catastrophic fire. The nickname spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar. One-Shot Lighter. Flying Zippo. All references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to explode. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, commanding F-4U Corsairs, later reported, "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere and they exploded. We actively hunted them." Through August, September, and October 1942, the pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Betty formations would depart Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August brought dozens more bombers lost. September saw no respite. October continued the bloodletting. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities. November 1942. Buna, Papua New Guinea. Australian forces overran Japanese airfields. Among abandoned aircraft, Allied technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying damage levels. Initial examinations confirmed pilot reports. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Engineers opened wing access panels revealing thin aluminum construction with no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Bettys examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This wasn't battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator featured them from early prototypes. Even fighters like the P-38 and P-47 had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing tanks used layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact with fuel. When punctured, the rubber sealed holes, preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight, but dramatically improved crew survival. American doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific, had fuel tanks offering zero protection. The weight saved was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives was equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. January 1945. Clark Field. Full examination. Major McCoy's team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system on tail number 763-12. Their classified report would be distributed to all Allied air forces. The specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight, 6,741 kilograms. Remarkably light for a bomber this size. Maximum takeoff weight, 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity, 4,780 liters distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing. Positioned in the wing center section, were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed, 428 km per hour. Approximately 265 miles per hour. Maximum range, 6,034 km. Exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling, 8,500 meters. Crew complement, 7 members. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, 2 gunners. The 8 fuel tanks were arranged along the wing's longitudinal axis where the wing joined the fuselage. This placement maximized capacity by utilizing the wing's thickest structure. But it also positioned tanks directly in the path of enemy fire. Any attack from side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant even small punctures leaked fuel continuously. American engineers calculated the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost and vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point. A single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. Kiro Honjo faced the impossible. Leading Mitsubishi's design team after taking over from Joji Hattori, Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s. He understood European aeronautical engineering principles before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises Western air forces would never accept. His team at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities analyzed every bomber design aspect. They calculated weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel at full load. To achieve required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would require hundreds of kilograms to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through rubber compounds and additional structure. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds. No armor plating around fuel cells. No fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers. No redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision wasn't made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew combat damage to wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft meeting performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft failing to meet requirements but offering better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber. Mitsubishi built the aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production models designated G4M Model 1 began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4MS were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond enemy fighter range, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. Guadalcanal exposed the fundamental flaw. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in sustained bloodletting Japanese air forces could not sustain. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Betty formations would depart Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, the exchange rate had become unsustainable. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involved casualties. But the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground. No wounded bombers limping home. No damaged but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. March 1943. Modification attempt. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets weren't true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 km. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. October 1944. G4M Model 3. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3 introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks, with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 km. A loss of more than 2,000 km compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. April 18, 1943. The Betty's most famous casualty. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18. The Admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing, would result in mission failure. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. At 9:34 hours, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of calculated intercept time, the P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation. Two Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6-0 fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanfear and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute precision over 400 miles of ocean. American fighters had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigation challenges. And the Betty bombers' vulnerabilities guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured any damage would be catastrophic. March 21, 1945. The Oka mission. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200 kg warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead's 1,200 kilograms of explosives would destroy any vessel it struck. But the mission depended entirely on Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The 18 G4M bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort, heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying the Oka loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range for the Oka weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. August 19, 1945. 4 days after surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed at Tsuji airfield carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft, given call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, flew to Ie Shima where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2 reference the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. The white Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. Production totals. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants. The G4M Model 1 comprised approximately 1,172 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world. But complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. The G4M Model 2 accounted for approximately 1,142 examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending maximum range even further. But the Model 2 retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The G4M Model 3 represented the only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war's end. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific theater. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating. Thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. Former Flight Petty Officer Masawato, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. Comparison with Allied protection. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier position featured armored glass. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward, introduced in 1941. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems. Roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, despite similar size and role. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%. A reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers. But American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. The production capacity meant American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every Betty vulnerability. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. Clark Field. January 1945. Final assessment. Major McCoy stood beside tail number 763-12, his report complete. The examination revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked him weren't an oversight, not a temporary expedient, not a design failure. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded. An aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for the mission requirements they received. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving the required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they weren't just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident. They were a decision. Legacy. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match. But its ultimate legacy is written in lost statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. Most Betty crews did not survive. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers, crossed vast Pacific distances, and died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires the aircraft's design made inevitable. The Betty bomber's story is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at the cost of crew survival. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. It stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability. When range is purchased with crew lives. When performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning Betty bombers that fell across Pacific skies marked the consequences of that philosophical difference. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply did not include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War.